Okay, so I was going to do the last section of this branching network stuff. Let me do that. And then we'll have some pieces in between, and we're going to get onto optimal supply networks. How do we structure things to make them spectacular? Okay, let's open the right object, this one. Okay, so as I said, this is sort of a smallish piece. Where do these networks come from? Are they going to be, we'll get to a big story actually about river networks and blood networks, but this is a, there's width to these things, but this is sort of this one-dimensional, locally one-dimensional structure that's branching and forking again here. This is filling a 2D space, this is filling a 3D space, so that ambient dimension will matter. This is, we're 3D things living in 3 dimensions. This is a 2-dimensional surface living in 3 dimensions, so that will matter, which is an interesting piece. Okay, so let's just talk about a couple of things that have been floating around. This was sort of, geomorphologists had thought this was the kind of explained everything, and someone came across a beta lattice or a Cayley tree and just said, okay, that's going to be our little toy model. And so these are quite charming things, right? It's from the 1800s, I think, originally, yeah. And the idea is you just make an infinite graph that has locally the same degree, right? Everyone has the same degree. So this is a degree 3 beta lattice, but it's rooted at a point as well. And this was sort of used to talk about, say, nuclear explosions and so on, right? How things take off. And of course for contagion and so on, this is sort of the basic diagram, right? So of course we think branching trees apply to a lot of things, and they do. But the problem with this sort of thing, which is a great, fun little mathematical thing to play around with, right? You can now do percolation on it and do all sorts of fun little games. Because it's got an exponential growth as you go out from, let's say, this root, then it's going to fill space absurdly, right? So this thing fits in, if you want to embed it somewhere, ultimately in some sort of, arbitrarily high dimensional space. So in terms of being a model for actual networks on surfaces, not great, but people had a lot of fun with this. There's sort of a stat mech thing you can do, which is count up all the lattice animals, right? That's actually one of the better terms in stat mech, right? Lattice animals. So you just make every little possible, you start here and make every little possible subgraph, and then you count up how much area they take up, right? Which is just going to be the number of nodes, and then longest stream length, and you do those sorts of things, and you can get Horton's laws and all these sorts of pieces, right? So it turns out, yes, they satisfy Horton's laws and Tokunaga. Well, that's an interesting one. I'm not sure about that because no one was thinking about Horton's laws at the time. So as I said, they're not connected with surfaces. Not good at all. But this was a paper. Who's this by again? One of these papers that comes along, Kirchner, who basically says you're all idiots. Like it has that feel to it. Like, what are you doing? Every branching network just does this. There's nothing interesting here, right? We're going to return, speaking of more recent version of that, we're going to come back to the little interaction between our friends online about power laws, which is fun. So more people said things. Okay, so I talked about Scheidegger's model, which was this very nice thing. So of course this is sitting in 2 dimensions. There's no problem with that. It's a triangular lattice, flipping coins for left and right. And this proves, so because of random networks, and we understand those things, we have lots of good stuff there. And I won't show it here, but basically it does satisfy Horton's laws and Tokunaga's laws, but they have funny numbers, right? They don't have numbers that are, they have interesting, complicated numbers that no one's derived analytically. That's fine, doesn't matter. But for the power laws, for drainage area and basin length and so on, they come out of river networks, as we talked about. They come out of random walks, I should say, as we talked about, and they have specific exponents, right? So Hack's exponent, for example, which is the way the mainstream length scales as area, is to the power of 2/3. All right. So it's a universality class, right? So that's a kind of a whole world of branching networks would fit into that box. There's a much more complicated thing came along, at least in you know, trying to involve physics and so on. I mean, the actual simulation perhaps not as complicated, but so now we have landscapes, and we're going to think of them again as these sort of satellite ones, right? So they're on a grid in terms of the evolution of, in terms of the simulation. And so the idea is that landscapes evolve such that you know, it's an optimization story, and this is something, you know, we're really drawn to. It's true in a lot of areas of physics. Although we're sitting here with brains, which aren't really the most optimal objects in some ways. They're pretty good in terms of wattage, but you know, a lot of the thinky bits do silly things. And platypuses. All right, so, but anyway, optimality is definitely a huge part of the real world. So the idea is there's going to be some flux of material, some force. We'll talk about this a little bit later for some other optimality things. And then the idea is the flux is going to be how much water is flowing through. Well, that's going to be proportional to the drainage basin area, right? So this is a non-local measure. So you have some point, of course, and you have the drainage basin area, and that's going to then represent the flux. This could be some power, but it's not. This is the slope, the local slope. So steeper, the more forceful, right? So you've got some amount of fluid coming through, and the steeper it is, the more impact it has on the landscape. And then this was used for that piracy stuff as well, right? This is an old story in geomorphology that slope scales very, very roughly as area to some parameter. So they just said, okay, we'll just make it some exponent, and we'll play around with that. You get landscapes that produce things that are somewhat near real networks. The numerical method matters, which is a problem. That's a bit disconcerting. And then a few years later, after all this came out, some of the Maritain, who's part of this team, will come back to, we'll see Maritain again. When we come to blood networks, showed that actually these systems produce 3 universality classes. The Scheidegger ones, which are fine objects, but you don't really see them in the real world. Self-similar ones, which are kind of not interesting because, you know, all the basins are self-similar. There's no crazy allometric scaling. And then a third kind of random network, which is a random resistor network. So that's okay, but there are 3 universality classes, not as general. And this is just some little summary of that. You know, this is the game we kind of talked about, which collapsing all these scaling laws for these networks, right? There was this whole list of them, and we got to this idea that really only a couple of parameters mattered. So this was Hacks exponent, which is how length scales with area in a basin, and D is the fractal. Here it is. It's the fractal scaling for the mainstream length in a basin. Very weak usually. So there are these kind of classes, right? So real rivers have this kind of, they're a half going up. We'll come back to this because this is this sort of big story for real, you know, for large landscapes. And these are these optimal channel networks from Rodriguez-Iturbi and Ronaldo. Ronaldo, lovely guy, played rugby for Italy actually for a while, which isn't saying that much I suppose, but yeah, good for him. Big strong lad. I mean, it's not New Zealand, right? Okay. So that's all I think about. Let's see. So so this is Scheidegger directed random networks, 2/3 for the Hack exponent. So you see, you get some interesting things, right? And you might start to say, okay, well maybe our landscape on Mars or on the side of a volcano is one of these, possibly. But as I said, no one's really. There isn't something I think for landscapes that's really universally agreed upon in terms of mechanism. Obviously we know how erosion works, but it is a complicated, messy business. Trying to sort of, think about the very small scale and zoom that up. Anyway, so this is just a quick summary, and then we'll wrap up this piece. So we have these structural laws of Horton and Tokunagi. We showed that they fit together, and that was a big step, right? Describe until you're pretty happy about that. Okay, let's explode this thing. Correctly done. So these are, right, we're not worrying about slopes. Lots of scaling relationships. Got all these parameters, right? The Horton ratios for numbers and lengths, and there was also area and stream segment lengths, and we saw that those things collapsed. Oh, that's my little problem. I miss these sometimes. This is using Z-LaTeX has made a mess of these. They should be natural logs. Oops. Okay. This is what you want to do for these big systems. If you can show there are only a couple of scaling exponents that matter, then you've achieved something. And of course, that's describing. And we've got to get to mechanism. Okay. This should be ln of R L over ln of R n. Right. Oops. We can do the distribution thing. I kind of jumped over that. And then lots of models, but nothing that's complete. I mean, we'll see. Okay. That's what I wanted to show you. It was just a very quick little piece about mechanisms, which in some ways shows you how far we have to go.